Hey everyone. Authentication is simply knowing that a user is who they say they are. If you've logged into a website before, whether it's through a username and password or having to type something on your phone, then you have authenticated yourself to that service. Firebase allows you to use many different methods for this. But why would you even want to use Firebase in the first place? Well, for one, it's just one less thing for you to implement, and we'll look at that in just a bit. Two is that authentication is something that's very easy to get wrong, and when you get it wrong, there are very bad things that can happen. So for example, leaking other users' data or being able to log in as somebody else, those are generally severe problems and something that you can easily avoid using Firebase. And the third thing is that Firebase authentication is a first-class citizen in Firebase. It means that if you're using cloud functions, if you're using Firestore, you can authenticate a user there without really any extra code. I want to bring you through a flow here that's going to cover what Firebase does for ease and security. But in order to do that, we need to understand a few terms. And don't worry too much about these. This will help you through the flow if you ever implement them, but if they seem confusing at all, that's totally fine. We can still understand the flow. OAuth is for authorization, even though typically people will still say it for authentication. But that comes from a layer on top of OAuth, which is called OpenID Connect. A relying party is someone like you typically who would be implementing a site that's going to rely on an identity provider, which would be a site like Twitter or Google, where you have login with that company button. Let's go with that login with Twitter flow and see what it takes to do that. First, you would go to developer.twitter.com and you'd sign up for an app. That way Twitter knows that you're using them to identify your users. And for now, you would just specify a fake callback URL, but we'll fill that in about 20 seconds. You will also get an API key and a secret from Twitter, which you will use on the next step, which is going to your Firebase console. And here we can see the Twitter is disabled. We would click it, we would enable it, and we'd paste in the key and secret that we got from Twitter. At the same time, we would get a link that will take back to Twitter to fill in that section that I said would just be a placeholder for now. From there, you would develop your front end. So you would make a site that's got a button like sign up with Twitter. And when you click that, it would launch a pop-up where you type in your Twitter credentials. That URL from before that we specified to Twitter is what's going to happen when you click sign in. That will get hit and you'll see a couple of parameters at the end. I don't have them showing right now, but that's where Firebase takes over. So those parameters are actually state and code where you send those to Firebase from Twitter. The state is for Firebase, the code is for Twitter. So Firebase is going to pass that code over to Twitter. And then it'll respond back to your pop-up with your access token and your refresh token. The pop-up communicates that to the parent, and then your site calls into the identity toolkit to verify those tokens. After all of that, here's what your Firebase console will look like. You'll see your user, and they'll have the Twitter icon next to them, meaning that they just authenticated using Twitter. Seems very straightforward, but what does the code for all of that look like? Very easy. It's only 2 lines. You make a new provider, and you could specify other officially supported ones here like Google or Microsoft or GitHub, and then you call sign in with pop-up. And what do you get from result? You get information about that user. So things like their ID, their email address, and then the access tokens. That flow clearly shows the ease and security that you get in that you didn't have to write very much code, even though you still had to develop the front end and put a button on your site. But let's talk about the integration now and see how this interacts with other services like Firestore. So with Firestore, you get on every request this auth parameter. And it might not exist, you might not actually be authenticated, but when you are authenticated, it will have your ID. So you can use this to compare it against a resource's ID to grant, read, write, and update access to somebody. You don't have to populate this auth property. You don't have to worry about if it's getting sent in a request. You can trust that Firebase is doing that for you. Similarly, you can do this with cloud functions. Cloud functions, the HTTPS callable ones, get context and data. And here I've written a very simple function just to make sure the user has authentication data. We don't know who they are, but we know that they've authenticated. So what we check is, do you have context and do you have auth for that? And if not, we throw an error. That's great, but let's look at how it's actually used here. You would typically then go get their ID and then compare their ID against, say, an ID that you're expecting or something that's in Firestore. Again, though, this context and auth are plumbed through for you. You don't need to do that. Auth is integrated. It's also easy to use from the client. Here are 3 examples of some quick calls you can make. You can call create user directly on the client. You can call sign in with email, call sign out. There are a lot of other functions here. The documentation is generally great for these. And again, I've got links to those in my notes, or you could just search for Firebase Auth and you'll find it. There was something that the documentation hadn't made as clear to me that I wanted to explain to you, and that's this onAuthState changed function. This is very important. The docs describe this as, this is called whenever the user's sign-in state changes. Let's consider that flow from earlier where we logged in with Twitter. We got information about the user's name, their tokens, their email address. Where does that go? Well, Firebase has configurable persistence controls. What that means is that you could have it just get stored in memory so that when you navigate away from the page, it's gone and you need to log in again. You could have it so that when you close the tab, it goes away. But by default in browsers, it's only going to go away when an explicit call to logout is made. So still, what happens with that? Well, there's something called IndexedDB in your browser, and that authentication information is going to get stored in that database. When Firebase initializes itself, it's going to pull this information from there, and it's going to check to see if the keys are valid by calling into the identity toolkit, and then it's going to trigger that event on authState changed, and at that point you could start doing things that require authentication, like fetching your user's profile image or calling into a function. My conclusion with auth is that it was mostly easy to use. There is one thing that I struggled with quite a lot that's going to be another video here, which was connecting to Twitch OAuth, which was not an officially supported identity provider. I hope you learned something watching this video. Thank you.